culling those pixels back, it's kind of clamping them out a little bit. So you retain detail in the interior of the scene and the exterior. An example of that is kind of when you see at the front of a door and you walk into a room and all of a sudden everything's really bright at the entrance and extremely dark inside the room. And that's because your eye is in the process of adjusting to that new changed lighting environment. You need to let more light in the dark spots and less light in the bright spots. So your eye kind of tone maps things in a similar way to the way Reinhardt works. So if you're doing architectural work and you've got a lot of strong contrasting lighting, then it's actually pretty decent to use Reinhardt, even though it's not physically correct. But retouchers and photographers alike will end up having to sometimes shoot multiple different shots at different exposure settings and retouching them together to do all that work for us. So don't be afraid to use Reinhardt, it's totally fine, but just know when you need it and when you don't. The next step before rendering is going in and checking the material subdivisions in the scene. Now, I've been using values between 80 to 220, depending on the lighting of a scene. If you've got a scene which is more an interior and it's strong global illumination, strong objects reflecting off each other like a lot of times, then you're going to need more reflection samples in those scenes than in a scene which is just a sphere on a plane. So my best kind of estimate for you guys is for a scene like this to use values between 2 and 250. And for an outdoor scene, like a car or something like that, you can use values between 90 and 120. So this scene being completely indoors, we're going to change the subdivisions to 220 for all the materials. So thankfully, you've got all of them lined up here. You can use a script if you want for this. In this case, there's not enough materials, so I just won't bother. I'm just going to do it quickly now. So I'm going to set them to 220 for all the material subdivs. Anything that doesn't have actual glossiness, it doesn't even matter anyway. So okay, I've done that now. Now I think we're ready to do a little test render. And I'm just going to do a little region render here just to make sure I know what's happening in the scene. Just to get a little mental reminder of what's going on. So remember, we set it to override. Alright, you can see that there's quite a lot of noise in the scene, and it's mostly coming from the global illumination. If we go to the reflection, there's also a lot of noise. In the sample rate, we've got the back here doing some really weird stuff where it's so noisy that it's having to use all 15 samples, and it's still not clean. And that's because I didn't change the brute force subdivs. So if we set the brute force subdivisions to 250 as a starting point and just re-render this, the render time slowed down quite a lot, but now in the global illumination pass it's quite clean, probably a bit too clean. So just cancel that render, don't even need to let it finish. I'm going to drop it down to 200 and try again. I'm just using network rendering at the moment, so there's a little bit of a slowdown at the start before rendering. Cool, so still really clean. We can keep going down. So we're at 200 now. I'm just going to set it to 160. I'm also going to change, what I like to do is I set the render bucket division really low, turn off distributed rendering, and just do tiny little tests, just because you only need to see a few pixels to understand how noisy they are. So now, there we go. I've set it to 160, and obviously it was never adding any more samples than 160 anyway, because of the threshold value. So logically the next step is to move on to the lighting pass. So let's take a look at that. And we can see that it's not great. It's not great at all. So I'm going to do another test render now, turning off the override material just so we can see the actual effect. So now we're rendering the scene how it should be rendered. Alright, so it's extremely noisy, and that's obviously because we never changed the subdivisions in the dome light. So I just got to find that somewhere out of the scene here, and it's at 8. So let's put that up to 200. Remember, this is just, it's just a starting point. And let's do another render. And now the lighting is a lot cleaner in the scene. I'm going to drop it down to 160. Do another test render. Noise hasn't changed much. Okay. Sorry guys, just had another crash there, so I've had to re-render the scene again. So taking off from where we were at, the lighting looks okay, but it's not great. So now we need to start taking a look at another render element, the reflection render element, and you can see that it's also quite noisy. And it doesn't really make sense because all the scene settings are set up correctly. The anti-aliasing looks fine. The material subdivisions in the scene look fine. They're all set to 220. But it's still rendering with heaps of noise. Almost a bizarre amount. So we need to figure out what's causing that. In this case, what's causing it is the depth of field. So you can see on the camera here that the subdivs are set to 8. We need to bump that up to 64, at least, in order to remove that noise, because you have to imagine that the the depth of field is throughout the whole scene, and right now a value of 6 is throwing everything out. So I'm just going to do a little region render again, now that I've changed that to 64. And it's fixed up. So a lot better. While my computer crashed, I noticed there was one little thing I forgot to implement, and I still had the subdivisions on the floor set to 8. So just keep double checking your scenes to make sure you're not missing anything. Alright, now also in the scene, we've got one last thing to do before we hit render. And that's the lighting in the scene that Peter's got set up through these IES lights. So I'm just going to turn off the dome light and do a region render down here. Sorry, I'll show you in a second. I'm going to do a little region render down here just to see the effect of those lights. We'll just swap to the lighting pass. And it's not bad. Just needed to double check them though. So their subdivisions are set to 8. I'm just going to bump them up to 16. Okay, now we're almost done. Just going to turn on the anti-aliasing filter. Just double check everything in the scene. It's all got 220. Okay, cool. So this should technically be a fully optimized scene. So I'm just going to render it for you guys and we'll start the video up as soon as it's finished. So there you guys go. It's fully rendered now. The final render took 9 minutes and 30 seconds and we ended up saving about 25% on the render time. So all we need to do is just compare the two, see what the quality is like between them. So if we take a look up close, my settings are a lot cleaner. We're getting more samples in the reflection now because what was happening in Peter's scene was he was using anti-aliasing to clean up the scene. So it was a physically incorrect render because essentially it was just, there wasn't enough information in the sampling, but there was way too much information in the anti-aliasing. So you're left with an image which isn't as clean. So I hope this proves to you guys once and for all that this method is the method. And I'm not an architectural artist, but it just goes to show also that you don't need to be. This is like these settings work universally. Sorry, not these settings. This method of optimizing your scene works universally. Zooming in everywhere. Everywhere is literally cleaner. There's way more texture detail in there. You're getting nice reflection highlights now that weren't there before. If we zoom in here off the wall, there wasn't enough samples there, but now there is, and the scene looks like it has a bit more depth in it. Looks a bit more realistic too. Okay, so that wraps up the third lesson. The fourth lesson, we're going to be going into some advanced materials, and then I'm going to finally start to actually show you the process I use for creating materials based on real world, like matching real world materials. So I'm getting pretty excited now because there's a fair bit of content and I'm not getting tired out anytime soon. I mean, this lesson was a complete nightmare, so I apologize for the delay there. But yeah, not much I can do about this one. But hopefully better for the next one. Alright, thanks guys. See you later.